Go ahead and turn in your Bibles. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 33. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 33. That's where our passage will be from this morning. As you travel through the book of 1 Corinthians, especially here about chapter 15, you see in this section where Paul is discussing the resurrection. And as he's discussing the resurrection, he is talking about the things that you and I surrender or give up, because we're looking forward to the time in which we'll spend with God. This world offers many, many wonderful and good gifts. This world offers many, many wonderful opportunities. But we have to choose wisely, invest wisely, so that we can attain the resurrection from the dead and live forever with Jesus Christ. And one of the things that Paul here mentions by inspiration of the Holy Spirit that you and I need to invest in is being around the right people and determining who it is that we allow to invest in our lives and into whom we invest into their life. There is a popular, and I'm about to show my age because I don't know what to call them. It's a meme, it's a TikTok, it's a reel if you do that on Instagram, where it shows somebody who's been watching a show. Say it's somebody who watches Yellowstone. Now, of course, nobody in here watches Yellowstone. But if you did, the person is sitting there in front of the TV, and they see the very first show of Yellowstone, and they're just dressed in T-shirt and pants. The next show, they're wearing a cowboy hat. Next show, they have on this big black coat. And next show, they have on these glasses, because one of the characters of that show dresses that way all the time. Or there's another version of it where a person sits down and they're watching a show called The Crown. And as they watch The Crown, the very first time they're just dressed regular. Next time they're sitting there and they're holding tea and their little pinky is sticking up. And the next time their posture is more like an English person's posture. And then, it goes on and they become more and more English. And what those things are talking about is how we're influenced by the people we're around. We're influenced by the TV shows we watch. We're influenced by the media that we see, whether it be online or whether it be television or whatever else it may be. We're influenced by the school in which we grew up, in which we went to. And as we think about that aspect, I want us to think about that aspect from the idea of being a Christian. Who is it that invests in your life that makes you a better Christian? And who is it in your life, if you've run across any of these sort of people, that makes it more difficult for you to be a Christian? We have to recognize the influence people have on us, and we have to recognize the influence that we have on other people. And so this lesson truly is talking about influence, but I thought we'd approach it from the idea of friends. And as I think about this, I think about somebody who has just moved to school. Maybe their name is Andy, and they've gone through a few classes, 3 or 4 classes, whatever it may be. They're in high school. And now it's time for the lunch break, and so they go through with their tray, and they get their food. And as they get their food, now we're in the lunchroom, and we look around, and the names of the groups change with each generation, but oftentimes the personality is the same. Andy looks around, and he decides, who am I going to sit with? Well, there's this group over here, and they all have got their cowboy boots on. They've got their cowboy hats on, if that's allowed. They're talking country, comparing their tractors that they have. Well, does he fit into that group? Then over here you have your athletes. And you see these people who, have really focused on the popularity that comes with being on the popular team and things such as that. And then you have these people over here who are dressed very well, and their parents are very well known. And then you have these people over here who are somewhat alternative or goth or whatever the term is that people use in the time in which you were in school. And then he looks across that group and he tries to decide, who do I sit with? Where do I fit in? Where is my spot in this world, in this culture, in this time? Sometimes perhaps that even applies to church. We come here and we attend and we look around and, well, what is my section of the auditorium, right? What is the Bible class, if you're an adult, that I should go to? Where is remember a generation ago we called it a clique? Where is my group of friends who take care of me and who I take care of, we rely on one another and text each other during the week, who we can go out and eat with? We're influenced. And we also give influence as well. Now, as we think about this, recognize, in a sense, and we'll talk about this at the very end of the lesson, you're friends with everybody. And you have a responsibility to be a good influence, whether somebody is close to you or whether they're not. Revelation chapter 12 and verse 10 says, love one another with brotherly affection. As a matter of fact, he says, outdo one another in showing love. Paul says here, by inspiration of Scripture, hey, it's your job to win the competition of niceness. It's your job to outdo everybody else in love, to be a friend more than anyone else. It's a holy competition which is there. Galatians chapter 6:2 puts it this way, bear one another's burdens, and by doing so you fulfill the law of Christ. Bear each other's burdens. Be there for other people. Be a friend who helps other folks. And so who is it who influences you? And who is it that you influence? Well, we'll look at a few different aspects of this. The first thing is your home family, your starter group. This is the family in which you grew up in. Each one of us is shaped by our parents, by our lack of parents. Each one of us is shaped by our siblings, by our economic aspect of how we grew up. Each one of us is shaped by where our family went to church, if they went to church. Each one of us is, in some ways, influenced by the styles in which our family influenced one another. In the book of Proverbs, Solomon says this, Proverbs 1:8, listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and don't forsake your mother's teaching. You see, each one of us grow up, we are influenced by the family which we grew up in. Proverbs 22:6 is a passage which we oftentimes speak of, and it says, train up your child the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. And it's a general rule that if you raise your kids in the church, in the Lord, they will have a head start in their relationship with God. But you know what? The converse of that is true. When you grow up in a family that does not respect God, when you grow up in a family where church is optional, when you grow up in a family where people don't want to give themselves, whether it be time, whether it be money, whether it be heart, to God, it's difficult for those children to break away from that influence and become godly people. As you and I read through 2 Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, we see so often the influence of each child king from the adult king, his father, his predecessor. Did he walk in his ways, or did he not walk in his ways? And we see that influence which is there. You notice Jesus grew, the very Son of God, by the influence that he had in his family. Luke 2:52, and Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. That wisdom and favor talks about that social aspect. The idea of favor with God, the idea of favor with man, the idea of growing physically and mentally. Each one of us, I think in some ways, as we mature and we can be responsible, can make a list, and maybe it's a mental list. What are 2-3 things that you learned from your family growing up that you appreciate, that you are thankful for, that you emulate or imitate in your own life? What are 2 or 3 things in the family where you grew up where you want to be different? My parents did this, but I want to do that. I grew up with this habit, with this tradition, but I prefer to grow up in this way. Every one of us, I believe, have families that had many good aspects and also a few bad aspects. And as we reach maturity, we begin to recognize both sides of that. An immature mind sees only the good, or an immature mind sees only the bad. But we have to recognize the influence which we've received, the family in which we grew up, and how it has shaped us. And hopefully we've reached spiritual maturity to where we see how we influence the family in which we're in, even when our kids are adults. What are some things that we learned from our families? What are some things that we need to unlearn from our family? A second sphere or area in which we see influence, and perhaps this is one of the greatest ones, is the person that we marry, our spouse, our mate. And as we think about this, we need to recognize, for those who are shopping still, dating, what is it that you should look for in a man? What is it that a person should look for in a lady? What is it that causes you to choose the person which you choose? Paul has an interesting way of putting this in 1 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 16, he's talking about a person who is in a mixed marriage. And what I mean by a mixed marriage, one is a Christian, but they're married to someone who is not a Christian. And as he talks about the struggle that goes on in that family where one is a Christian, one's not a Christian, Paul says in 7:16, 1 Corinthians, how do you not know that you're going to be the person who saves your spouse? How do you not know that you are the person through whom godliness is found in your family and in your children? And that's a deep theological discussion happening there in 1 Corinthians 7. But I think we can extrapolate that. I think we can bring that verse out and not rip it out of its context too much to say that's the job that you have as a spouse. Your missionary field. Some people go to Benin, some people go to Mauritius, some people go to Russia, some people go to Montana. Your mission field, first and foremost, is your home. You bear influence upon that spouse to lead that spouse closer to God. And those who are still shopping, who are not married but are looking to marry, one of the greatest things you can do is find somebody who brings spirituality into your home. Find somebody who makes it easier for you to love the Lord. There are some families which they find a spouse who makes it hard. And thankfully, there's many families who make it easy. If you're already married, many times people hear this lesson and say, man, I'm already married, and maybe I picked right, maybe I picked wrong. Every one of us has a responsibility to make our home to be a more godly place. Even if we're single, even if we're widowed, we have a responsibility to make our home to be a godly place. In Ephesians 5:22-33, it talks about submission. It talks about leadership. It talks about love. And as you go through each one of those key words or power words in that passage, Paul is using the illustration of Christ in the church. And Christ loves the church to the point where he sacrificed himself, gave his life up, and nourishes the church every single day. Because of that love which is there. The church loves Christ to the point of where it follows Jesus. Because it knows that is the pathway to God. Recognize the influence which is found there as we think about those sort of things. The third aspect I want us to look at is trying to stay with the S. I call it a strainer. These are friends to avoid. Now, there's many times where you can find a lot of friends. Proverbs 18:24 says, a man of many companions will come to ruin. But there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. And what that verse is telling us is just because you have a lot of friends doesn't mean you're doing it right. It's a quality of friendship. And I'm talking about close friends here. The quality of people that you allow to contact your heart. You need to find those who are closer to a brother and who do not pull you down. The quality which is there. You see, Whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but the companion of fools is going to suffer great harm. Think about that for a little bit. Solomon, the wisest man who has ever lived. The guy wrote part of the book of Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. The guy wrote at least 3 books of the Bible. That is how wise he is. He's called the wisest man who has ever lived, but he put himself in the wrong crowd. You see, he began to marry people who didn't love God. And it had a political reason. You marry the daughter of Pharaoh, well, Pharaoh's not going to invade your country. He's going to make a good deal because he wants his daughter to do well. You marry the daughter of Babylon, that's a good political and business decision because it opens up some trade routes. And so Solomon, in his wisdom and his business acumen and his political work, puts a lot of people in his life. And even though he's wise, even though he was raised godly, he looks up and he finds himself not where he needs to be spiritually. So the wisest man destroyed himself by having the wrong friends. Judges 13 through 16. Samson, the strongest man. This guy lifted some gates that were well over a ton one night, carried them close to 7 miles and set them on a hill just to show the city where he was living, just to show them how angry he was. Incredibly strong. And yet he found the wrong person. And when he allowed Delilah and he allowed other people into his heart and into his life, he found himself weak and blinded. He found himself, in some ways he thought, useless for the service of God. God did find a use for him. But the strongest man who ever lived put himself in trouble because of the people he allowed to be in his life. David, the closest man to God. The man after God's own heart. The man who wrote Proverbs 23. The man upon whose body and seed the entire kingdom of God would be established, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. He allowed the wrong people to influence him. And when you study David closely, you see that there's not a worse family man in the Bible than David. Look what happened to all of his children. Look what happened to his wives. Look what happened to all those who loved him, and what happened to those who depended on him. Now, wisest man, strongest man, most spiritual man, all failed because they allowed the wrong people to influence them. Now here we are, 2,300 years later. In fact, much more than that, because some of these people lived in the Old Testament. And we think, these people don't influence me. These people don't have an effect on me. They do. Be careful who you allow in your life. Don't hang out with those who tempt you. Be careful about those people who are always negative and always gossiping. Avoid those people who are always draining you. And avoid those folks who make you complacent. Notice that last point. Avoid those folks who allow you to become complacent and allow you to become lazy. You'll run across friends who say, you've made it. And they don't push you. They don't help you. They don't encourage you. And because of that, you begin to rest on your laurels and coast along. And you find yourself to be in trouble. Proverbs 22, beginning of verse 24, don't become friends with a man who's given to anger or to a wrathful man. Otherwise, you're going to learn his ways and you will put yourself into a snare. You become guilty for the people that you're around. Next, we see the succeeders. These are the people you need to seek out to allow to be in your life. They're the folks who encourage you, the folks who support you when your world falls apart. They're the folks who push you to be better. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 11, encourage one another. Build one another up just as I've seen you doing, Paul would say. Proverbs 27:17, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. We're aware, Ecclesiastes 4, aren't we? 2 are better than 1. For when one falls down, he'll have somebody to lift him up. When one person's cold, the 2 can come together and warm themselves. A 3-corded strand is not easily broken. Put yourself around folks who, when you're cold, will keep you warm, especially spiritually speaking. Put yourself around folks where when you fall down, they don't run away, they don't laugh. They're there to pick you up. They're there to support you. They're there to help you. Amos 3:3, can 2 people walk together unless they're agreed? You ever go walking with somebody, and as you're walking with somebody, you walk with those fit people who walk really fast and it wears you out? Don't you hate those folks? I say that jokingly. Or you walk with somebody who just meanders along, and it feels like it's going to take you an hour to get anywhere. You see, friends want to be together even more so than they want to finish the journey. And so they work on walking the same speed, walking the same way, so that they can remain together. That's the kind of friends to seek out. Those who lead you closer to God, those who lead you closer to who you need to be, those who help you see your potential. And there's not a lot of those kind of people in the world. That's who we need. That's who we have to have in our life. And the last one I want us to look at is the searchers. If everybody in your life, everybody you know looks like you, votes like you, thinks like you, you're doing it wrong. You need to know people who have different belief systems. You need to know people who think different ways, who go to a church which is not the Lord's church, who have views which are different than your views, who act and think and have different backgrounds than what you have. Something that's happened in our modern culture, I believe it's happened more modern times than even in times past, is how we become very similar to all the people we know. It's interesting many times when a Democrat is elected president, many people will say, well, every one of my Facebook friends or Twitter friends or whoever else it may be is Republican. How in the world could anybody vote for a Democrat? And it's interesting sometimes when a Republican will win, many people say, everybody I know votes Republican. How in the world could they have won? There's times where when we talk about evangelism in the church, that's a hard pull for folks because they don't know anybody who's not a New Testament Christian. I'm not talking necessarily about close relationships like I spoke about earlier. But we need to reach out and we need to be friends with people who are not like us. We need to be around people who do not make us comfortable. In Luke chapter 15 and verse 2, fascinating passage to me. The Son of God comes down, and imagine, if Jesus was today here in bodily form once again, where would we expect to see him? Well, he's going to be right here in the front row at church. Or if he came early enough, he might be on the back row like everybody else. It's kind of a joke. He's going to be with all the godly people. He's going to be at the Christian college, right? Well, that's what they thought in the first century. Hey, Jesus, you're supposed to be in that temple. You're supposed to be in that synagogue. You're supposed to be with the Pharisees. Where did Jesus go? Luke 15:2. This man, he eats with publicans. This man dines with sinners. He is talking to prostitutes. And Jesus says, of course, the Son of Man has come to seek and save that which was lost. Luke 19:10. And so there he is at the well, speaking to the woman who's been married over 5 times, John 4. There he is with the woman in adultery at his feet, John chapter 8. There he is seeking out Zacchaeus. Jesus was a searcher. because he recognized the power of influence. And you and I sometimes need to get out of our shell. You and I sometimes need to break out of what's always comfortable so we can reach people and bring them closer to Jesus. Romans 12 talks about how you and I have an obligation to be among those who are lowly of estate, those who are outcasts of society, and those who need help. Jesus says in Mark 16:15, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to everyone who looks just like you." No, that's not one of those new translations, is it? Go and preach the gospel to everybody who's already comfortable, that you're already comfortable with. That's not what it says either. Peter had to go to that house of that Gentile Cornelius, didn't he? Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. All right, let's go to our last slide and review what we just talked about. You're influenced by the people that you're around. And you influence those people that you are around. Your primary influence has been the family in which you grew up. But as you've matured, you see who you are and what you need to change. And so beware of the family that you're in, and make sure it's a family that brings people closer to God. Be careful about those people who drag you down, and find people who will lift you up. And spend your influence on folks who don't expect it. Love in occasions where it surprises people. Know people who need the grace of God and encourage them to be what they should be. It's a holiday season here. It's a time of family dinners. It's a time of family traditions. And for some people, it's a time of loneliness. It's a time of depression. Let me remind every one of us, we're a family of God. And Jesus is with us even today. There's not a one of us who's alone. There's not a one of us who's by ourselves. And as the followers of Jesus, we're here also, one